Hey folks, it's Andrew from Red, and today we're going to talk about some of the differences between an LED-based red light therapy device and an incandescent-based red light therapy device. Both of these, have a lot of similarities. Maybe you can screw them into a socket. Obviously, there's a lot of LED panels on the market. And then we've got incandescent bulbs, which have been around for a long time. They're used in heat lamps and food warmers and for chicken coops, and for medical benefits as well, for the infrared, for the heat. So this is actually going to be kind of a preamble to dispel some of the differences in the myths around these two, and to clarify some things about incandescent red light bulbs, because I'm going to do a review on a bunch of different brands, on Philips and Ruby Lux and a couple other brands, but I need to clarify some of the myths and misconceptions about these bulbs, about the incandescent bulbs, that have just kind of gone a little bit out of control, and there's a lot of confusion about that. So if we can clear that up, I'm a big fan of both techniques of incandescents and LEDs and any kind of red, light-based therapies that you can get your hands on, as long as you use it appropriately. I'm not against any of it. Just get whatever you can and use whatever you can, and whatever works for you. I won't argue with it. So, we can take a look at these. Obviously, I've got the LED-based product on right now. I can hold it in my hands. There's not a lot of heat that it's generating, so you can hold it in your hand. Obviously, I can't hold this in my hand while it's on, because it'll burn my hand. This will run at 250 watts. It's actually consuming 250 watts. That's a ton of power, and so that's why you need the right kind of lamp stand for it, or they sell clamps and different types of stands for them, and make sure it's rated for the amount of power, 250 watts. So as soon as I turn this on, it's pretty much already running at 250 watts. You can feel the heat immediately, and usually you want to be at least 18 inches away, so you don't get too much heat buildup as you use it. So that's pretty much one of the hugest differences, is this is mostly non-thermal. Maybe over time this will warm up a bit, whereas the incandescent bulb heats up right away. It's emitting a lot of heat. You don't want to touch it because you'll get burned. So that actually goes into pretty much the first myth, is what's the definition of photobiomodulation? Because a lot of people will get a heat lamp, and they'll, especially with the marketing from some of these companies, they'll think they're getting the equivalent of an LED. And, they're just different technologies. There's not one's necessarily better than the other in terms of benefits. But when you look at the science, the definition of photobiomodulation pretty much clearly states it's a non-thermal process, a non-thermal science of the interaction with light and biology. And so that's a very important distinction. They specifically wrote it to exclude incandescent bulbs. So that's why if you do a literature search on photobiomodulation and incandescent bulbs, you won't get any hits of specific studies just on incandescent bulbs. Maybe there's a few that try to experiment with heat and light, but it's very few. Most of the studies are with non-thermal application, like low-powered lasers and LEDs. And so that's where the science starts to diverge. There's a lot of science, maybe 5,000 or more. You can look on PubMed, and there's some databases mostly around low-powered lasers and LEDs. It's a lot harder to find science for incandescent bulbs. And like I said, I'm not knocking on incandescent bulbs. There's still a lot of benefits. We just need to be clear about the definitions and the science, and make sure the customer knows what they're buying. So that's fine, because we can get into one of the main arguments around this myth is the spectrum that an incandescent bulb emits. And now the spectrum it emits is based on incandescence, based on black body radiation. It's a pretty kind of straightforward concept, where if you're heating an object up, Imagine like a glowing ember from a fire, or a blacksmith with a red hot piece of metal. What's happening to that metal, as it gets hotter and hotter, it starts to emit visible light. So that's why it starts to glow red. It's emitting red. And then as it gets hotter and hotter, it'll emit more wavelengths of visible light, like white light. And that's how you get sunlight and incandescence, because they'll start to emit white light, because they're so hot. So that's how incandescent bulbs work, and they go back very far. And as part of the spectrum for the incandescent bulb, they do emit some red and some near infrared, similar wavelengths, overlapping wavelengths to what you would find in an LED. Like if we care about 660 nanometers or 850 nanometers, usually within the 600s and 800s is what we're really talking about with LED-based photobiomodulation. Certainly, an incandescent emits, those same wavelengths. Maybe not proportionally as much. There may be, some people say about 14% of the wavelengths coming from an incandescent bulb kind of overlap with the spectrum that we talk about with LED. So that's that's kind of the thing. You can say, okay, an incandescent bulb, you can take a look. You can take a look. It's because of the red coating, you start to see more of an orange kind of color. So it's definitely got red. It's definitely got near infrared in it. And so that's why some companies would argue, oh, you get some overlapping PBM effects. And, that might be true, but like I said, you're also introducing a lot of heat effects too. So there's that overlap, and that science isn't very clear of heat and light and what's going on with that interaction. And like I said, if you prefer more heat, or if you prefer non-thermal, that's kind of an important choice that you make when you're looking at these. This feels really good for your skin. It feels really good to warm you up in the winter, or good for muscle recovery, workout recovery, because it gets you warmed up and your circulation going. So again, there's no denying the benefits. It's just, and that the benefits overlap with photobiomodulation benefits. But we need to be clear about the science. Even if the wavelengths are overlapping and the light is kind of similar in some ways, you still got a lot more power coming out of this too, and that's part of the heat. It's not, that's kind of one of the myths is, oh, because it's making longer wavelengths, past 1,000 nanometers, mid-infrared, that's why this gives you some heat. Well, yes, but also just due to its 250 watts. This might be emitting only 5 or 10 watts of optical radiation. And so if you had a very high-powered LED, or if you had a very high-powered laser, you would certainly feel heat. And that's where we're coming into, some companies are trying to increase the power of all their LED-based products, and that's going to be problematic in the future if they go too far and they make LEDs that are way too intense. We're getting pretty close with some companies. So that's a big difference, is the intensity also is a big driver for feeling that heat. It's not just wavelengths, it's intensity. And I would say intensity is actually more important of a driver, because let's say you've got some infrared, but you have a little bit of infrared, you might not feel much heat. So it's very proportional, it's very dependent on intensity and not just wavelength. Everyone talks about, oh, infrared's the heating wavelengths. Well, yeah, that's true, but you also need to look at intensity. So that's the other thing. One of the last things is with incandescence is flicker. Incandescent bulbs do flicker, and I'm going to measure that when I do my review and see if there's any differences in the different brands of incandescent bulbs. They do flicker. There's an AC cycle. There's no AC to DC adapter or anything. It's just runs right to the filament, and it heats and cools, heats and cools. And I've measured a couple heat lamps already at about 2% flicker. And that's not That's, you know, that's not much, especially compared to old style LEDs and old fluorescents. That's why a lot of the influencers and people would say, oh, throw out all your LEDs and go back to incandescents, because LEDs used to have high flicker. But nowadays a lot of LEDs, and you can see some of my testing in my reviews, a lot of LEDs are very low flicker at 1% or even lower. Most of my GimmaPred products are 1% or lower. So LEDs can actually be lower flicker than an incandescent bulb, which a lot of people are still having trouble believing, because a lot of these influencers were just saying, oh, there's no flicker in an incandescent bulb. There's no flicker, you know, it's heat, you know, it just stays hot. And that's not true. None of these influencers have even measured the flicker properly on an incandescent bulb. So how do they know? So it's kind of like, well, you know, we gotta like take a step back and actually measure some things without just jumping to conclusions. So that's the thing with flicker. The last thing is actually the spectrum. Is it natural? You know, again, is it something that we were evolved to feel and understand? One of the things is kind of like, well, we know about incandescence, we know about black body radiation, we know the sun is a black body radiator, and you know it's emitting an incandescent kind of spectrum, very similar to an incandescent bulb. But we also have the atmosphere. We have water and molecules in the atmosphere that are filtering a lot of the light from the sun. So what we use, when you use an incandescent bulb, you're actually experiencing some wavelengths of infrared that would have normally been absorbed by the atmosphere, absorbed by the water molecules in the atmosphere. So you're getting unnatural wavelengths from an incandescent bulb. Has anyone told you that? Probably not. An important thing is you can look up clinical studies on water-filtered IRA, so water-filtered IR-A. And what that is some of these studies for therapies, they add a layer of kind of a water filter in front of it, and that pulls away the unnatural infrared frequencies. That pulls away, you know, some of that. So you get a different kind of therapeutic response compared to just an incandescent. But none of these companies are telling you about that. None of them are offering you to get a water filtered IRA unit. It's just a cheap heat bulb. So that's kind of another big misconception. It's not as natural as you want to believe. You know, again, LEDs, you can argue, aren't as natural either. They've got more of a narrow distribution. You know, let's say 660. It's got a narrow distribution around 660, 850. But usually, you know, again, you were choosing wavelengths that are clinically studied, that have been shown to be beneficial. You know, and they're not, you know, they're not foreign to us from the sun. 660s in the sun and 850s in the sun. So again, you know, you can argue it both ways. That's why it's kind of like, well, don't knock on LEDs if you're not going to be clear about your incandescent bulbs either. You know, we just see a lot of funny business that way. And, you know, we start to see even more funny business from companies like Sauna Space that are showing you this repository of research. And then as you're going down this list, you realize most of the research they're referencing is LEDs. And so you're like, what? They're referencing LEDs, even though in some of their FAQ or whatever, they're saying LEDs are a fad or whatever, and incandescents are more natural, they've been around forever. But it's like, well, why are you referencing so many LED studies? Why don't you reference some more incandescent studies? Do they even exist? There are a few, but not as much, you know, as LED and laser. So it's kind of funny. They're cherry picking what we see. You know, again, even with LED companies, I call them out on it all the time too. They cherry pick all these studies, take them out of context, tell you you're going to get some benefits, but it's, like I said, it's completely out of context. It might not be relevant to the device that they're actually selling you. And speaking of actually, one of the things I'm going to measure when I look at different incandescent bulbs and some of the claims they make, like say Ruby Lux versus Philips versus Sauna Space. Some of these companies are talking about really funky spectrums that they say, oh, you know, I think it was Therabulb, they claim to have like a narrow spectrum. And Sauna Space, they claim to have a special spectrum now with their new bulbs. And I was like, you know, how are you going to defy the laws of physics and of black body radiation and tell me you've got a special incandescent bulb that does something that defies nature? You know what I mean? It's not like you can do much with the filament, with the coating. There's really not a lot of technology that goes into these that you can change around. Maybe you can change the temperature the filament burns, and that's what Sauna Space claims. But then when you look at the spectrum that Sauna Space is posting, and they say this is our actual spectrum, and if you zoom in on the visible light part of the spectrum, it's emitting a lot of 400 nanometer to 500, that's blue. It's emitting, you know, 500 to 600, that's, you know, some teal and green. So it's emitting blue and green on their actual spectrum. And I was like, how is that possible? If you've got a proper red coating, it's like a blue blocker. If you wear a red, you know, red coated blue blocker or an orange blue blocker or whatever, it's blocking blue and green. That's what the red coating does. You know, it's not doing anything special. So why Sauna Space showing that they have red and NIR for blue and green coming from their incandescent bulb that they claim has got a special spectrum? Well, I think they're using the spectral output, the laws of incandescence. You know, you can model it, and that's probably the graph that they produce. It's a nice smooth graph. And without a coating, this is just a regular incandescent heat lamp, similar to this. The same technology goes into this and this. Just this one's got a red coating, this one doesn't. And so this one emits white light, which contains blue and green and all the spectrum, white. So I think Sauna Space is calculating their actual spectrum, which isn't what they're delivering to you, because it's filtered through a red coating. So, you know, again, companies like Sauna Space, they claim to have something special, but then they're wrong about their own spectrum. They're using a solar power meter to measure intensity, which we know is wrong. And, you know, they're making up a lot of claims about LEDs and cherry picking those claims from LEDs and taking it for their own. So it's like, do they even know what they're selling you? First of all, do they believe what they're talking about? And, you know, are they aware that all of their measurement techniques, their spectrum, their intensity, everything is just wrong? So I'm going to measure, you know, hopefully I'll get that Sauna Space bulb soon, measure it out, compare it to some of the other bulbs on the market, see which ones are, you know, getting their facts right, and seeing if we can rank some of them out. You know, if people care about more or less power, or people care about spectrum, try to measure some of these differences. And I'm concerned most incandescent bulbs are going to be the same. You know what I mean? There's, like I said, there's not a lot of technology from one brand to another brand. What's going to be the difference? I don't know. I thought this would be a very redundant kind of review to measure 5 different incandescent bulbs and prove they're all incandescent bulbs. You know, what am I going to prove? With LEDs, you know, there's a lot of, you know, flicker with different drivers and EMFs with fans and drivers, and, you know, different wavelengths depending on the diodes you use. So LEDs are a little bit more interesting when you measure the differences out. Incandescent bulbs, like I said, there's not a lot going on. So hopefully, you know, this helps clarify. Like I said, I'm a big fan of incandescent bulbs. I've used them before for pain and for, you know, aches and pains and muscle relief and things like that. So, you know, I'm not trying to knock on it. We just got to start clarifying that. That way the consumer isn't confused. You know what I mean? So you understand what you're buying. If you get benefits from it, that's great. You can talk about it. So that way, you know, you don't tell me, oh, I got some benefits from red light therapy and you say, oh, well, it was from a heat lamp or an LED or what was it? We need to be specific and understand the differences. And that's all I'm trying to get us to. Re-baseline, get rid of some of the myths and get rid of some of the lies and just talk about the truth. And then we can all talk the same kind of language and the same kind of knowledge base. And it's not just some companies just pretending like they have something special or proprietary, but it's based on a lot of fallacies and myths. Doesn't make sense. So thanks for tuning in. Hopefully this helped clarify more things than confuse. And you know, there's a lot of overlap with these concepts and these topics. So it's important just to kind of work them through and work them out and, you know, see what resonates with you. So, like I said, thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk again soon.